Yaakov Katz, and welcome to a new episode of the Jewish People Policy Institute's Inside Analysis of the state of affairs in Israel and the Jewish world. Today is obviously a tough day here in Israel after the friendly fire incident that killed five. Today's obviously a tough day here in Israel. Apologize for that. I'll go back. Today's a tough day here in Israel after the friendly fire incident that killed 5 IDF paratroopers last night. So soon after Yom HaZikaron, the IDF Remembrance Day, and the war and casualty death toll continues to climb. On today's episode, I spoke earlier with Gabi Mitchell, a longtime policy analyst who currently serves as director of undergraduate studies at Notre in Jerusalem. Believe it or not, but Notre Dame has a presence in Jerusalem just near the neighborhood of Gilo. I too was a bit surprised. We speak about Turkey, which is one of his specialties, the energy sector, what the Houthis in Yemen have done to disrupt all that, as well as the 140 days that Gabi did in reserves in the Miluim up north, and what he learned during all that time about Israel's chances to win the war against Hezbollah. I'm then going to be joined by JPPI senior fellows Gil Troy and Shmuel Rosner. We have a lot to talk about regarding the war, how we appear to be stuck, at least in my judgment, the mood here in Israel, and what comes next. Here we go. First, I'm going to play the recording with Gabi Mitchell, and then we will go to the panel with Gil and Shmuel. Gabi Mitchell, the director of undergraduate studies at Notre Dame, Jerusalem. And to those who don't know, there is a Notre Dame facility in Jerusalem. It's great to have you with us here at JPPI. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so we're talking because I just think you have a lot to say that could be interesting. You spent about 140 days almost in Miluim in reserve duty, so we'll get to that in a moment. What was that like? And I read some of your Substack posts, so I do strongly recommend to listeners that if you're looking for interesting content, Invisible Boundaries, that is where you want to go to read a bit more about what Gabi has to say and what his thoughts are on the region, on the war, on what's going on policy. But you also you spent a lot of time in the policy world for different think tanks, Mikvim and others, and you are something of an expert on the energy sector in the region and on Turkey. So I want to talk a bit about Turkey as well. But before that, you're 41 years old. Why were you doing 140 days of reserve duty?
It's a great question, and one that both I and my wife asked repeatedly over the course of the war.
Because just so our listeners know, by 40, you're supposed to be out of reserves. Now, there are cases where people stay on. We're about to hear in a moment.
So I would say that I was somebody who probably, back last summer during the protests against the government's judicial reform, somebody who participated in the protests, somebody who felt very strongly that the direction that the government was taking was not the right direction. And because I was already past 40, I would jokingly say, well, if there's an issue, they're not going to call me anyway. But if they were to call me, maybe I would consider not showing up. Right? I was very much in that camp of reservists who felt like something had been broken in the the unofficial contract between the state and the public. And of course, on October 7th, I felt very strongly that whatever I had said in the past, there was no question that I was going to show up. The real question of what you're asking is, why was I called in the first place? And I know that for most people the sense is that 40 is the cutoff age, and somebody gives you a phone call and says, do you want to stay on a little bit longer or not? I never got that call. I did receive a call on October 7th, just like everybody else in my tank unit to show up. And on October 7th, I didn't ask questions, right? What I came to understand afterwards was that technically, the army can hold you until the end of your 40th year. So you can imagine, the war starts, it's October, November rolls around, end of November, I don't ask, but somebody turns to me and says, well, at the end of December, you're supposed to be let out. Do you want to stick around? Do you not want to stick around? Which was an interesting kind of dilemma to be faced with under the circumstances. Like so many people who were called up from Miluim on October 7th, the first couple of weeks, if not months of the war, there was very little home time, right? And so you feel the tug and the pressure of home while also feeling a commitment to the people in your tank, the most immediate people around you, as well as the broader sense of the country is at war. If I don't do it, who will, right? In the end, the Knesset signed an extension. I think at the 90th minute, at late December, to extend anybody who was meant to be released at the end of age 40 for another 2 months. And I was, my unit was sent home at the end of February anyway. So it just kind of played out that I stuck around. There were definitely,
yeah. So where were you? I mean, you're in tanks. What were you guys doing for 130 days?
Yeah, my unit was assigned to the Golan Heights. We were in the Golan Heights for the entirety of that period. Obviously, tanks are mobile, so our tanks moved around over the course of the 4.5, almost 5 months that we were there. I think that what's so interesting about the war itself is that obviously the epicenter of the war is in Gaza. There's a second front that is no less significant in my mind, in the Galilee and the border with Lebanon. The Golan Heights both borders Lebanon and it borders Syria. It's definitely the quietest of all of those arenas by comparison. But to say that it's quiet or completely quiet would definitely be far from the truth.
Yeah, I mean, my brother was up there for also about 80, 90 days, infantry reservist in those I forget the names now of those borderline outposts that are on that triangle of borders, Syria, Lebanon, Israel. And they were getting, mortars and drones and getting hit. And obviously, of course, if there's a wider scale war with Hezbollah, that will become a hot border. And let me just ask you on that point. It is the quieter of the two, although today, as we speak, there's barrages of Katyusha rockets that Hezbollah is launching into Israel in retaliation to an attack that Israel carried out deeper inside Lebanon. But where do you see it going? I mean, as someone who kind of analyzes the region, but also now had most recently spent a long time up there.
Yeah.
Where do you see this headed?
Well, obviously there can be different layers of analysis here, right? Both in terms of the relationship that Israel has with Hezbollah historically, but also under the current circumstances, and how those two actors are engaged in an open conflict with one another. That if it was any other year, that would be the war, right? But because so much of the focus has been on Gaza,
I call it the mini war.
Yeah, right.
Even though it's not mini. I mean, we have 100,000 people who aren't in their homes, and we just had an Israeli who was killed this week, right? So it's far from being a mini war, but comparatively correct.
And I think that what you mentioned about the number of people who have been evacuated out of their homes really places a lot of political pressure on the government and on the military to find some kind of solution. Unfortunately, from my perspective, I don't think that there is a military solution. If we were to kind of like go back to the last real war with Hezbollah in 2006, we entered Lebanon, we invaded it, we destroyed tremendous amounts of Hezbollah's infrastructure, and we reached an agreement, and that agreement has since been violated, right? And so I think that there's reason to be concerned about the limitations of a military intervention, because we understand, and certainly we understand after 6 months of fighting in Gaza, that kind of conflict isn't going to deliver ultimate victory, whatever that may mean. And we also have concerns about the diplomatic approach, because the diplomatic approach at the end of 2006 reached a resolution that has since been violated, right? And so we're kind of in a catch-22. The diplomatic approach has limitations. The military approach has limitations. Ultimately, it's quite likely that there will be a combination of the two, which of course should be of concern to everyone, because we understand that Hezbollah is not Hamas. Their capacity is far greater. But I also think that Hezbollah is not Hamas in terms of the way that they strategically approach their conflict with Israel, and what they want to get out of it.
But, philosophically speaking, right? Obviously, personally, I'd prefer there not to be a war. But philosophically speaking, for a moment, we see what they're capable of doing. We see how they're attacking us. We see how people are not in their homes, and how will they go back home is a question in of itself. And by the way, I mean, people often think it's because of the rockets or this. That's not the fear for the people along the border. I mean, now they're able, Hezbollah just shoots there because they also know that there aren't really
there aren't that many people there. Yeah,
right. But it's the infiltration, it's the October 7th scenario that really has people concerned. So that you have this fierce, violent, oppressive, strong enemy on the other side of the border. Philosophically speaking, they have to be destroyed, or they have to be degraded to an extent that you can go back there. Realistically, also, because of what you just said, though, well, military solution, there probably isn't one. You can degrade them and destroy maybe all of Lebanon at the same time. That won't get you any friends around the world. But we also know, on the other hand, that diplomatically, that's also not a solution. 1701, the UN Security Council resolution that brought an end to the Second Lebanon War and took UNIFIL, that UN force, and beefed it up from, like, I don't know, Indonesia and Ghana forces to, French, Italian, Spanish, and whatever, and went from 3,000 to 12,000 or even more. They didn't really do much either.
No, they're effectively observers.
Right. So what is the solution?
I mean, I think that the solution is much broader than what Israel can do on its own. It requires partners in the region to be a part of that process. But I think that Israelis and the Israeli government also need to be realistic about the limitations of Israel's capacity in changing the domestic realities within its neighbors. That applies, of course, to the Palestinians, but it also applies to the Lebanese, where despite multiple international efforts, and some of them more successful, some of them less successful in various capacities, Hezbollah has a stronghold in Lebanon. It has a lot of popular support, not the entire population, but until that process evolves in some way, shape, or form in which Hezbollah's influence weakens, it's unlikely that an outside influence or an outside force is going to uproot Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a part of the fabric of Lebanon, whether we like it or we don't like it. So the question is how to live with it. And I think that this is not just a challenge for Israel, it's a challenge for a lot of Western states who for 20 plus years have been grappling with Islamic fundamentalist groups that turn into political organizations and are deeply embedded within their respective societies. That kind of transformative change generally doesn't happen through military conflict. It happens through education, happens through social change, right? And so it sounds pessimistic. It is a pessimistic reality of, like, we kind of have to live with it. But I don't think that given what we've seen over the last 6 months, that Israel entering Lebanon is going to produce a better outcome than the outcome that we see in Gaza right now. And of course, as I said, Hezbollah is not Hamas. That is not the same conflict. It's not the same set of casualties. It's not the same set of geopolitical implications and consequences. And certainly, I wouldn't recommend this government, which has very little public support, going in that direction. But nobody in the government asked me. So
I'm not even sure they know what they're doing at this point. Which is quite depressing when I think about it a bit. Is that it feels at times that we're a bit lost. But I want to I want to tap into your two specialties of energy and Turkey in particular. Let's start for a moment with the energy. You know, the Houthis who have really disrupted a lot of shipping, and that's like something I heard the other day. Went to a store, we wanted to buy something, and they're like, "Well, the Houthis, right? That's become like the Israeli retail excuse. Oh no, they're stopping the ships. We can't get them here. They can't come from China." So, what is actually going on? How has this really affected the energy sector? And is it impacting the price of oil, gas around the world? Where does that stand at the moment?
So in general, right, when we think about our region or the immediate region around Israel, we think about it both in terms of the large quantities of fossil fuels, oil, and gas that exists in the region. But we also need to understand that our region is also a passageway between Asia and Europe, essentially between two hemispheres, and it's one of the most heavily trafficked shipping lanes in the entire world as a result of that demand from both directions. The involvement of the Houthis in this conflict, seriously depressed international shipping companies' interest in traversing through and around Yemen. And as a result, a lot of international shipping has been redirected around to avoid that area down through Africa and up around through Africa in order to reach either the United States or Europe. We see that impacting oil prices, but we see that impacting a lot of commodities as well because of the additional time that it takes for materials to reach their port of destination, right? So in general, has it completely altered the global economy? No, but it's delayed processes and the delivery of supply. And so we have seen an impact on kind of, the cost of particular items and the cost of particular goods, so much so that it did galvanize both the United States and the European Union to send warships to that region in order to, quell Houthi unrest, for lack of a better way of putting it. Because, of course, the bottom line for the United States and for Europe, just like any countries, is reliable access of supply. And the Houthis were disrupting that in ways that the war between Israel and Hamas or Israel and Hezbollah was not. And so the international intervention there was specifically as a result of the Houthis interfering with core American and European interests.
Mm-hmm. And tell me, Turkey is, Erdogan hosting Hamas leaders violently in a vile anti-Semitic rhetoric, calling to cancel trade, then trade is back. What is Turkey's game here?
So obviously, if we look in the past history, Erdogan has been very vocal and supportive of the Palestinian cause. In each preceding, escalation of violence between Israel and Hamas over the last 15 years, Erdogan has criticized Israeli policy. And I would say one distinction between him and, let's say, other leaders in the region is that between support for the Palestinians in general and support for Hamas, Erdogan has increasingly taken a position of, I'm supporting Hamas, right? I support the Palestinian people, but specifically within the arena of Palestinian politics, I support Hamas. He's obviously not alone. Qatar is another big-time supporter of Hamas. What I would say, if I was to differentiate the way that Turkish policy and Qatari policy have manifested themselves, is that Qatari policy has been one of financial support, right? But also keeping doors open with all of the actors in the region. So keeping an open channel of dialogue and communication with Israel while it supports Hamas. Whereas Erdogan has neither put his money where his mouth is, historically, but also it's really only been rhetorical support for Hamas. There have been occasions in the past where Hamas cells have operated within Turkish territory, and that's been a sensitive spot for both parties.
Al-Ruri was there for a period of time. Turkish companies are financing Hamas activities also.
Yeah. We have to remember that when Israel made a deal for Gilad Shalit, it asked Turkey to take in some of those Hamas individuals. So in the past, there was a more nuanced relationship between Israel and Turkey, but obviously over the course of 15 plus years, the mechanisms for dialogue have faded away. The lack of trust is more and more prevalent. But I would say that, you can't understand Erdogan without understanding domestic politics. His party lost municipal elections at the end of April, and he was criticized both from the right and from the left about his policy vis-a-vis Israel. How is it possible that after 15 years, you're the biggest supporter of the Palestinians, but you've never challenged Israel with the one aspect of the relationship that has always survived, which is economic ties? We're talking about $9 billion of annual bilateral trade, really significant. So if you're so serious about it, well, why don't you do something about it? And so for the first time, he did do something about it. And as you correctly pointed out, there are a lot of different voices in Turkey. Turkey is not, a country in which everyone thinks the same way as Erdogan. There were actually a lot of people very close to him who have business interests in Israel who are very critical of this decision. And we are already seeing that there are
they're walking it back a bit. Yeah.
Walking it back. There obviously both Israeli and Turkish companies are circumventing the ban by indirectly, using third-party ports in order to onload and offload the containers. But the important thing to understand here is that banning trade it doesn't just hurt Israelis, right? I kind of jokingly say one of the things that we import a lot from Turkey is cement, which is and a lot of other building materials. And I jokingly said, okay, it was impossible for me to buy an apartment before Turkey placed the ban. Now it's still impossible. So, what have you really changed? But more importantly, it hurts Turks because the lack of trade will damage the Turkish economy. The Turkish economy is in dire straits, and it also hurts Palestinians in the West Bank who are recipients of Turkish exports via Israel, right? And so the entire approach is kind of a flawed approach, but it is reflective of Erdogan's desire to be relevant, both internationally and domestically, and the lack of meaningful dialogue, diplomatic mechanisms between the two countries.
Okay. Gabi Mitchell, thank you so much for joining us. It was great to have you on the JPPI podcast. Thank you.
Thank you.
So that was Gabi Mitchell. Good to have him on the podcast. And now joined by Gil Troy and Shmuel Rosner. Good to have both of you with us. Let me see that.
We have difficulties turning up the video, but other than that, I'm here.
Got it. We have you both. So the first of all, let me use this opportunity, Gil, to pass on our condolences to you recently on the loss of your father.
Thank you.
Long life to you and your family. There's a lot to talk about, and the situation, I don't, maybe for a lack of a better term, Gil, but the situation here kind of sucks. I mean, what's your take?
I know I'm the resident optimist, but it starts with a leadership vacuum at the top. We don't have a prime minister who speaks to us, who talks to us and lifts us up on Yom Ha'atzmaut and deals with the complexity of things when we're wondering about the day after and all kinds of other things. And we're starting to see tremendous tensions in the cabinet, even within the Likud party, which has had quite the code of omerta for much of its year and a half existence. So there's the governmental problem. There's a fear, as Gabi Mitchell was pointing out, up north. And most important, there's the overlying tension about Gaza. And the Gaza tension is on two levels. One is we're starting to once again go back to that thing where you turn on your phone and you see 5 killed, you see 3 killed, you see 2 injured. And that's taking us back to November, December, and is very, very painful in that way. But the underlying thing is also the fear with the Americans. And back in October, back in November, we felt the United States of America had our back. And are they going to manipulate munitions? Are they going to undermine us diplomatically? And still, over 220 days later, we don't have the hostages out. So there is a kind of sobering sense that how do we get out of this?
Shmuel, we recently at JPPI did a poll that you oversaw and did kind of show that the majority of Israelis are not overly optimistic with the way the war is being managed and the direction where the country is going in.
Well, we saw two separate things, and both of them are worrying. One is that for the first time since the start of the war, we've been conducting surveys every month since the start of the war. And every month there was a majority of at least Jewish Israelis, not Arab Israelis, but Jewish Israelis who showed high confidence in the ability of Israel to win the war. This changed in May. For the first time, we saw more Jewish Israelis who don't have much confidence in the ability of Israel to win the war. So more Israelis have low confidence in our ability than high confidence in our ability. And this is a shift. This is a shift that we must acknowledge. It is to be expected in some way because of the passage of time. But the fact that more Israelis today don't feel or aren't certain that Israel is headed towards victory is a significant fact. The other thing that we saw is a general tendency of decline in the sense of optimism about the future of Israel. This is not specifically about the war. We had a question about confidence of winning the war. We also had a general question about the optimism versus pessimism concerning the future of Israel. And here we saw a change since January. We asked the same question in January, and we saw a clear decline and I wouldn't say dramatic, but significant decline in the way people see the future of Israel. So as we lose confidence that we can win the war, we also lose hope for the future of Israel. And of course, when you combine this with the saddening news of soldiers losing their lives in the south or in the north, one must ask himself, why are we still losing lives? We understand losing lives in a war when we believe that we can win the war. But if we aren't going to win, then every life lost is just wasted life. It's a loss for nothing, and this is a truly depressing thing for Israelis to think about.
Kind of reminds me, as you're describing this, reminds me of the security zone in Lebanon, where we were obviously there from 1982 up until 2000. But in the years preceding the pullout and the withdrawal, there very much was a feeling of what is Israel doing here, and why are there boys every year, a few dozen, getting killed for what purpose, and
right,
and where is it taking us? And by the way, that wasn't good politically. I mean, who cares about politics when people are losing their lives? But when you think about the politics of it, it's not exactly a good position for Netanyahu to be in. And there definitely is this feeling that Israelis are stuck and that the war is stuck and there's no vision and there's no plan. I've just, been listening to Netanyahu and his different 17 or almost 20 interviews that I saw that he's given to only the foreign press, by the way. He doesn't interview with anyone in the Israeli media for the obvious reason, right? Israeli journalists will ask him tough questions, and he prefers Dr. Phil over someone who's going to ask him, when you say local Gazans will take over the Gaza Strip, who are these local Gazans? Where are they going to get resources from? Who's going to control them? Like, it sounds like we want to import Somalia into Gaza. But Gil, based on what I guess I was saying, and you said it, and Shmuel now giving us the scientific data, proving the state of depression that we're in, how do we get out of this?
First, a historical note of caution. When I was a kid, I stepped on a clam, and as the surgeon was taking the pieces of clam out and was sewing me up, I asked him, I said, how many stitches is this going to be? Because in boy culture, the more stitches you have, the cooler you are. And he said, never ask a surgeon in the middle. We'll always wait to the end. And it's very, very easy in the middle of a war, in the middle of a slog, especially when we Israelis are used to the 6-day war and the 3 weeks of Yom Kippur, and we're not used to this kind of very difficult urban warfare, to jump to negative conclusions. And so on one hand, the historian in me says, I know that if we had polled Americans in 1942, when the Japanese seemed to be on the rise, many Americans were unsure that they would win then. So you never know. And we also know that some wars are won militarily and lost diplomatically. Some wars are won diplomatically and lost militarily. So it's still a dynamic situation. But that goes back to my main point, which is leadership, leadership, leadership. We just finished the two most holy days in the Israeli national calendar, Yom HaZikaron, Memorial Day, and Yom HaAtzmaut. And if you think about it, every death of Yom HaZikaron takes on significance because the narrative that the parents and survivors put on it, that the community puts on it, and that the leaders put on it. And that's where the vacuum at the top becomes so painful, so problematic, because when you don't feel that the deaths are there because they're meaningful, you don't feel like the deaths are there because they're advancing the pieces on the chessboard, you don't feel that there's a government that has your back, that's when you not only start getting depressed and despair, but you also start getting really angry and start feeling betrayal. And yes, let's not put politics aside. Let's put politics front and center. This is a political challenge as much as it is a military and diplomatic and existential challenge. And Bibi Netanyahu, even for his own reelection purposes, and the fact that he's even considering it is to me hard to believe. But let alone if for his own political survival purposes, has to figure out how to speak to the people and has to figure out how to change the narrative, because morale is also an essential part of wartime, and it is an essential national asset in fighting a war. And so when you see diplomatic troubles and military troubles and political troubles and morale dropping, you've got trouble.
And we do have trouble. And I think what also highlights that trouble is that, at least in my view, maybe I'm wrong, but there was an alternative, right? And there maybe still is an alternative, but we're not going down that route. By the way, just about Netanyahu for a moment, some of the things that he is saying, which is not instilling, we're going to fight with our fingernails. And it was actually my wife, Chaya, who said to me, Yaakov, it's not fingernails we're fighting with, it's our boys and our girls, right? It's our sons and daughters. Those are the fingernails of Israel. And we see, sadly, how these people and these kids and soldiers are paying the price. Shmuel, I do want to ask you, though, about the politics of Netanyahu for a moment, right? We saw, for example, on Yom HaAtzmaut, on Independence Day, for the first time, as far as I can tell in Israeli history, the prime minister did not attend any of the state ceremonies. There was the soldiers who received the citation of excellence from the president with the chief of staff at the president's residence annual ceremony. Netanyahu was not there. There was the event, the Chidon Tanakh, the Bible quiz. Not my favorite show. Interesting, but usually prime minister comes, asks a question. He was not there.
It's the Netanyahu's favorite show because they have family members who won prizes
Sarah's
in previous
brother,
years.
Right? Sarah's brother.
Right.
And their own son was a runner-up, I think, in the quiz at one point.
True.
And then the third was the Israel Prize, which is Israel's highest award to its citizens. And he didn't come to that. Now, he went to visit wounded soldiers, obviously important, can be done though any day of the year and should be done more often as is. He didn't say why, but obviously I think we can all understand he was afraid of heckling. He's afraid that maybe Eyal Waldman, who was one of the people who got the Israel Prize, wasn't going to shake his hand. He didn't want to be put into those situations. And I thinking to myself, hey man, if you want to be prime minister, part of it is also you face your people, right? And he doesn't want to face the people. So Israel's growing isolated in the world, and Netanyahu is increasingly isolated from his own people. Where do you see him taking this? What's his vision right now?
Well, I'm not sure. First of all, I must say about Independence Day, Yom HaAtzmaut, the fact that he didn't show up for any of these events is not just a matter of facing the people. There are also many conspiracy theories mushrooming in Israel because of his decision not to appear in any of these ceremonies, in any of these events. people begin to wonder if everything is okay with him. If can he be can he sit with other people without showing any signs of some trouble that he has, maybe health problems, etc. I don't have any evidence for any such thing, but I can tell you as a fact that people are talking about it. This is something when the prime minister does not show up and does not give any explanation for his absence, that's trouble for him.
Yeah.
And it's a ripe environment in which conspiracy theories tend to arise. Where is he going with this? In some ways, reality is closing in on him. When you look at the draft law with the ultra-Orthodox, for which he does not have a solution, and the deadline is coming next week, the Supreme Court is going to discuss this matter. When you see him struggling with his relations with the United States administration, when you see his own defense minister convening the press and talking against his vision, against his policy, against his strategy, publicly basically defying him and saying, his strategy is the wrong strategy, and he does it for political reasons. So there are troubles within the government, there are trouble with with public opinion, with the outside world, with the legal establishment. Wherever he turns, he hits a brick wall. For now, he manages to somehow survive. But if you ask me, people begin to feel that this might not be a great solution for Israel.
Yeah.
Now, will this be the cause for, to have no election? To have no election is the result that most Israelis would accept right now. There is a majority in Israel of almost 70% of people who say we need no election within 3 months or in the coming fall. It's not, the differences are becoming small. In 2024, we need no election, but to have such outcome, you need at least 4 or 5 people from within the coalition to rise up and say, well, this is what we need to have. And up until now, except for the defense minister, which seems to suggest the option that he might be supportive of such a proposal, we don't yet see other people raising their hands or voting with their feet.
And don't hold your breath based on the way Likud has been until now.
Well, I don't know. I'm at some point the public opinion begins to impact even the most loyal member of the coalition. If people begin going on the streets, if there are demonstrations, if there are strikes, there could be strikes in Israel. The economy is struggling. There are so many moving parts that the governments currently can't control that at some point I think the coalition will reach a breaking point, and maybe the best option for Israel is to decide on a date for new election.
Yeah.
And up until then, to have a unity coalition that manages, just imagine if Netanyahu were to say, in November, we will have new election, and up until then, let's have a unity a government for the emergency situation, and we can move forward with handling the war as one body. This could have been a great solution. I'm not holding my breath.
I laugh.
I see you smile. Yeah, I don't think
because
Netanyahu
I think it's a great. No, I think it's a great idea, and because it's a great idea and it's the right thing, we can just know that it's not what's going to happen. Unfortunately,
I agree.
Not in our. I mean, again, like what's right is what doesn't happen. Sadly, in Israeli politics. Gil, just one last question: the Benny Gantz Gadi Eisenkot duo, who clearly, I mean, it's hard to get into their head because they're definitely suffering they can't enjoy sitting around a security cabinet table with Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir. We know that. They claim that they're having influence, but it's very difficult nowadays to see what that influence is and where it is, right? What do you anticipate looking at what's happening? I would guess their time is limited, and maybe it's time that they pull out, actually.
Look, it's very interesting to compare people's perceptions of Gantz and Eisenkot in November and December. November, December, people said, wow, they're heroes. They've brought us stability to the government. They've helped us bypass Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. They've created a real, they've reflected the real consensus. And people, frankly, were very critical of Yair Lapid for not being
going in.
Right. And he really could have been a foreign minister in a sense, and have spoken to the Americans perhaps in a way that might have improved things. So it's interesting to see kind of how we've gone from November, December to the the depths of depression in May. And so, yes, I think Gantz and Eisenkot are also feeling it. But look what happened. People always said, Gantz, he's a nice guy, but he's not that clever a player. And this week, when Bibi, trying to be Bibi, and comes out with this brilliant idea of, I'm going to take a draft of the draft bill from the Gantz, Lapid, Bennett days, and going to put it, that's going to be my solution to this whole Haredi mess. And Gantz says, right, people say, look, Bibi's caught Gantz. And Gantz says, I'm not playing that game anymore. Gantz says, in a sense, Bibi, you're still stuck in October 6th. That solution, which I indeed put on the table a year and a half, 2 years ago, doesn't work now because since October 7th, we realized we need more boots on the ground. And I thought that was a mark of maturity on Gantz's part, but also a mark of real clever, craftsmanship and statesmanship. And it shows that he knows that that things are shifting, but he also knows that he has to live up to a different kind of set of expectations. I do want to say that, when you talk about November elections, the American historian in me goes, I think the notion of being under the gun from Hezbollah, under the gun from Hamas, under the gun from the Houthis, under the gun from Iran, and having an American presidential election, which so many people think is the most significant election of their lifetime, playing out, and then adding to it for the next fall, an Israeli election, is not a perfect storm. It's just a perfect mess. And so I think one of the issues in the Israeli political system, it shouldn't be, but the Israeli political calendar, as always, is affected by the American political calendar, and how that plays out and what ultimately would be the best solution is something that's very complicated. I would start with basically Netanyahu saying, I'm going to retire on X date, not when we get to this situation, but on a particular date. And I think that would change dynamics because everything he did would no longer be seen as political. It might be seen as statesmanlike. It might be seen as legacy.
Even if he says I'll retire on November 5th, 2030.
Oh, that's the fear. I mean,
that would be the problem. No, but
I think he's playing to 2050. That's
2050. Sorry, I apologize. Right. But by the way, I mean, with the November 5th is the U.S. presidential election. Israeli elections have to be held on a Tuesday. That's also a Tuesday. So hey, I mean, that would be quite fun, right? Why not?
Once you're pressing a reset and throwing it all up in the air, just go crazy.
Might as well go all the way. Thank you very much, Gil. Thank you very much, Shmuel. Thank you to Gabby for joining us earlier before. And thank you to all our listeners and viewers. We'll be back on Monday with another episode. In the meantime, have a wonderful weekend. Let's hope for some quiet and safety for our soldiers, and Shabbat Shalom.